The whole world was engulfed and hit with conflict during the Second World War. Only Antarctica, outside of global warming, was saved from being hit by this global affair. Yet, focus is almost always given to three theaters: the Pacific, European, and to a much lesser extent, the North African campaign. Yet, many other regions and nations were caught up in this conflict as well. And in today's video, we'll be exploring one of these conflicts that tends to not get mentioned much in the retelling of history. This is the British invasion of Iraq. Iraq came under British control following the end of World War I. The nation was established as a mandate which granted them some levels of autonomy, but they were still subject to British control. The nation would gain full independence in 1932, but a previous treaty signed in 1930 granted the British military base rights and unrestricted troop transport throughout the nation. By 1937, few British troops were left in the territory. However, as war brewed in Europe, two British air bases in Iraq would see reinforcement, one being near Basra and another in Habiana. These bases were used to secure British oil interests in the region, and at the start of the Second World War, would also act as training bases and recruitment centers for British troops in the region. In September of 1939, the Iraqi government broke off diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany, and in March of the following year, the nationalist and anti-British Rashid Ali replaced Nur al-Assad as Prime Minister of Iraq. Rashid Ali made contacts with German representatives to establish some levels of diplomatic relations between the two governments again, though he was not yet an openly pro-Axis supporter. In June of 1940, when Italy joined the war, the Iraqi government did not break off diplomatic relations, and the Italian Legion in Baghdad became the chief center for Axis propaganda and for fomenting anti-British feelings within the Middle East. On April 1st of 1941, Rashid Ali and a section of pro-German senior military officers overthrew the Iraqi government in a coup and aimed to push the nation into an alliance with the Axis powers in Europe, viewing the British government control in the region as far too weak to contest this move. Yet, for the rest of the month, reinforcements for both Iraqi and British forces were raised and flooded into the country, and on May the 1st, tensions between the two would finally boil over. The British in the region at the start of the conflict had around 24,000 men raised and equipped under the overall command of Major General William Fraser. This force included a handful of British regulars, as well as a slew of colonial troops from around the area, many of which had been transported from India or were locally raised militia units. The British also had an armored car company made up of 18 Rolls-Royce armored cars made during the early 1920s. The company also had two functional large tanks and a single Carden Loyd tankette. They could field around 100 aircraft, which was a mix of Gloucester Gladiator biplanes and a handful of other types. The British Navy in the area consisted of 4 patrol boats, later reinforced by the aircraft carrier the HMS Hermes and 2 light cruisers, with the ability to call upon ships from the Eastern Station Squadron if needed. However, naval combat did not occur during this war. The forces under Iraq were comprised of around 60,000 men, most in 4 infantry divisions and 1 mechanized brigade. Within the mechanized brigade, it comprised of a light tank company, an armored car company, 2 battalions of motorized infantry, and an artillery brigade. The Iraqi army, while fairly decently equipped, was not particularly well trained, and a large section of it was comprised of irregular and militia units. The Iraqi Air Force was largely a mix of British and Italian-built planes, which was 60 strong and centered out of Baghdad, with a naval force consisting of 4 gunboats and a minesweeper. When fighting erupted, it was centered largely around the British base at Habyana, which the Iraqis were besieging. On May the 2nd, the British launched a series of airstrikes against the Iraqi-held positions, and throughout the day, the pilots from Habyana flew 193 sorties and claimed direct hits on Iraqi transports, armored cars, and artillery pieces, while only losing 5 aircraft themselves. The attack surprised the Iraqis, which included the government. Many of the soldiers in the army thought that they were merely on a training mission and didn't think they were actually going to war. The government didn't expect that the British would actually fight, and instead would settle for a negotiated surrender. But if you know the British, you know that they're really damn stubborn. For 3 more days, British aircrafts would rule the skies, launching heavy attacks on not only Iraqi supply lines, but also airfields in major cities and even the Iraqi encampments. By May the 6th, the Iraqis led up the siege, leaving a large section of material, including around half of all of their artillery pieces. The siege at Habyana cost the British around 100 casualties, while the Iraqis suffered around 600, with many more being captured over the next few days. Iraqi reinforcements were spotted a few miles away from the base, and RAF pilots gunned down hundreds, if not thousands, leaving the path to Baghdad largely open. The Germans had been informed of the ongoing war, and after some deliberation, material and weaponry would be sent to Iraq via Vichy's French Syria. This would include a number of German aircraft under the command of Colonel Werner Junk. This force would number around 24 craft, all while attacking British-held positions. Junk's forces also aided in moving supplies from Vichy Syria into Iraq, but by the 18th of May, he had lost around 30 of his air force, being whittled down to just 3 craft by the end of May. An Italian contingent of 12 aircraft was brought in, but they had little to do with the ongoing fighting. Habyana was secured by the mid of May, and reinforced by troops from Palestine and Transjordan, the British went on the offensive, with the towns of Fallujah and Ramadi being the next main objectives, before marching onto Baghdad itself. Both towns were occupied by an Iraqi brigade, with Fallujah blocking the main route to Baghdad, and Ramadi blocking any British troop movements to the west of their current position. However, the forces at Ramadi would be left not attacked, due to the heavy fortifications and the self-imposed flooding of the area, so all attention was focused at Fallujah, with battle plans going into motion on the night of the 17th. A British party crossed the river and managed to capture a handful of Iraqi artillery pieces, with them managing to capture the main bridgeway to the city. A full-on attack on the town started in the morning, and by the 21st, Fallujah was in British hands, with them able to hold off an Iraqi counterattack the following day. On the night of May the 27th, the British advance on Baghdad began. The advance made slow progress and was hindered by the many destroyed bridges over the irrigation waterways which had to be crossed. Faced with the British advance, the Iraqi government of Rashid Ali collapsed, and him, along with a bunch of the cabinet, fled to Iran, later going on to Germany. The mayor of Baghdad came to meet the British on the outskirts of the town, and they quickly signed a peace treaty and armistice, putting a halt to hostilities. On June the 2nd, Jamal al-Gaddafi was named Prime Minister of Iraq, while a pro-British monarch and government was re-established in the nation. While this would largely put down the war in Iraq, the forces under British command in the region would not yet be finished, and instead, Iraq would be used as a springboard to launch not one, but 2 invasions, one to the west and one to the east. But that is a topic for another time. The quick collapse of France during World War II was a shock to many in the world. Its colonial empire was largely administered from a German puppet government known as Vichy France, and there was a major worry from the Allied High Command of antagonizing the puppet French government enough that they'd openly fight against the Allied forces. However, this didn't limit Allied actions against the state, and in today's video, we will be looking at one such conflict, the British invasion of French Syria. In May 1941, French Admiral François Darlan, deputy of the Vichy French state, signed the Paris Protocols with the Germans. The protocols granted Germany access to military facilities in Vichy-controlled Syria. The protocols remained unratified, but Henri Dentz, the High Commissioner for the Levant, was instructed to allow German and Italian aircraft the ability to refuel in Syria. They would be marked as Iraqi aircraft, and Axis aircraft were landed in Syria, en route to the Kingdom of Iraq during the Anglo-Iraq War, which I have a video already uploaded on the channel about. The Germans also requested permission from the Vichy authorities to use Syrian railways to send armaments to the Iraqis in Mosul. The months prior to the Lebanon-Syrian campaign saw the Middle Eastern Command under General Archibald Wavell stretched to the limit. He was faced with an ongoing campaign in North Africa, and with his force significantly depleted following the disasters in Greece and Crete, Wavell learned of Churchill's desire to invade Syria and Lebanon, something that Wavell personally opposed. There were several reasons for Churchill's desired invasion, chief among them being the possibility for Lebanon and Syria to be used as a base for the Germans, should they be allowed to enter the area by a sympathetic Vichy France. This would threaten vital Allied oil supplies in Iraq and Iran, as well as Haifa in Palestine. This fear was exacerbated by the coup of the pro-Axis Rashid Ali in Iraq on April 3rd of 1941, which again threatened oil supplies through the Middle East. Had the Germans effectively supported the revolt, it may have posed an even greater threat to security in the unstable region. Should the Germans secure a strong foothold in the region, the political and diplomatic repercussions, both there and in Egypt and Turkey, posed a potential threat to the Allied war effort. And while Wavell knew that his force was stretched extremely thin with the fight in North Africa, he had no choice but to agree to Churchill's demand, so he appointed General Henry Maitland Wilson to oversee the operation. In terms of troop numbers, in Syria-Lebanon, French Army General Henri Dentz had around 85,000 regular troops at his disposal, under the Army of the Levant. This army was still divided into troops from Metropolitan France, colonial troops, and the so-called Special Troops of the Levant. The colonial troops were formed by 11 battalions of infantry, 3 Lebanese light infantry battalions, and 8 Syrian battalions. In addition, there were 2 artillery groups and miscellaneous supporting units. These so-called special forces included around 5,000 cavalry, organized in squadrons of around 100 men each. Included in the cavalry force were 15 squadrons of Circassian cavalry, of which 3 were motorized. These special units were led by indigenous and non-commissioned officers. In combination to this, the French also had an armored/mechanized contingent, which totaled 90 tanks, which were mostly Renault R-35s with a few Renault FTs, and a similar number of armored cars. On the naval side, the French could muster only 2 destroyers and 3 submarines. The British, on the other hand, were able to muster around 34,000 men, 18,000 of them being from Australia, and another 8,000 British regulars, which was supplemented with some Czech battalions that were in the region. This also included around a 5,000-man Free French units that were also assigned to the task. They could field around 100 aircraft, with a naval contingent which contributed the landing ship of the HMS Gladiator, 5 cruisers, and 8 destroyers for the operation. The invasion of Syria was to be split into 4 invasion forces: a thrust on Damascus and Beirut from Palestine, a thrust on northern Syria and Palmyra from Iraq, and a final thrust on Tripoli, also from Iraq. With the two thrusts from Palestine, they were the first group to engage Vichy forces, with the Iraqi troops invading 2 weeks later. They had 10 set-piece battles taking place during this months-long campaign, and the Australians bore the brunt of the fighting for the region, and as you can expect, tensions between the head of the Australian Corps, which was a man by the name of John Laverick, and his British superiors soon happened. General Wavell and other individuals didn't seem to understand the terrain, and they underestimated the enemy to a heavy degree, both in terms of troop numbers and quality. This lack of understanding of the enemy and the terrain was compounded by Maitland's decision to base himself in the luxurious King David Hotel in Jerusalem, about 200 kilometers away from the main fighting. From here, he attempted to run the entire campaign prior to Laverick's promotion on June the 18th of 1941. Wavell, meanwhile, was primarily concerned with operations in North Africa, and from the beginning, he stated his opposition to the campaign on the grounds that he did not have the available resources. With him torn between numerous fronts, Wavell thought that the Vichy forces would simply surrender at the sight of Australian units, and during the first few days of fighting, they didn't even give the men helmets, and the maps that were provided to them were on such a scale that they were utterly useless. The first set battle was at Ladanal River on June the 9th, one day after the start of the invasion. Australian forces came under fire from well-defended Vichy forces on the flip side of the river. British commandos managed to cross the river after being landed, and they took the defenses, but suffered heavy casualties in the process. A Vichy counterattack by armored cars was driven off, and the Australians were able to establish a pontoon bridge to continue on their advance, and they were able to win a handful of set-piece battles along the way. The next major action would occur at the Battle of Kosovo on June the 15th, the last main stronghold before Damascus. The hills surrounding the terrain made even travel by foot difficult if they were not on the road, and the city's layout allowed the French ample pre-built defense capabilities. Heavy fighting would occur at Kosovo, but the Vichy defenses were largely too strong, and over 300 British soldiers had to surrender after a day of fighting. It was decided that the city would be bypassed, and they'd march onto Damascus itself. Damascus was heavily fortified by a ring of forts and in-depth trenches. British and Indian troops managed to capture and hold onto a handful of the forts on the night of the 19th. Counterattacks failed to break the British and Indian positions, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The initial advantage that the French Air Force enjoyed did not last long. The Vichy French lost most of the aircraft, as it was destroyed on the ground where the flat terrain, the absence of infrastructure, and the absence of modern anti-aircraft artillery made them very vulnerable to British attacks. By June the 21st, the French garrison in Damascus was running out of food and ammunition, thus they surrendered to the British forces, yet the campaign was not yet over. From here, there were three main actions that occurred at French garrison cities, ones that housed the majority of the still remaining Vichy French troops that were left in Syria. On July the 1st, fighting occurred at the city of Palmyra, which was fortified by 300 Vichy French forces, which had been a rallying point for the remaining French forces in the area. An Australian detachment managed to capture the city, and they took most of the garrison captive, scattering the regrouping French. After the Battle of Demore on July the 8th, the fate of the French in Syria was sealed. Henry Dent sought an armistice which was into effect the following day, and around 30,000 miscellaneous Frenchmen surrendered by the 12th. Most of them decided to be expedited to mainland France, rather than join the Free French forces, which was a major blow to the recruitment effort, as was being hoped from this operation. Around 2,500 Frenchmen and around 5,000 British/Commonwealth troops had been casualties during this month-long campaign, making it much more costly than what was originally anticipated. Operations against the Vichy regime in Syria could only be conducted with troops withdrawn from the Western Desert, a dispersal that contributed to the defeat in Operation Battle Axe, and made the Syrian campaign take longer than necessary. Churchill had decided to sack Wavell in early May over his reluctance to divert forces to the Iraqi War, and Wavell was relieved on June the 22nd, relinquishing command on July the 5th. In late July of 1941, French General de Gaulle flew into the Syrian territory to congratulate the victors, and he placed French General Georges Gatto in control of Syria and Lebanon. On November the 26th, shortly after taking up the post, he recognized the independence of Syria and Lebanon in the name of the Free French Movement. After elections in the territories on November the 8th of 1943, Lebanon became an independent state, and on February the 27th of 1945, they would both declare war on Germany and Japan. Yet, by the end of the war, the French would renege on this independence recognition, setting the stage for the first major incident post-World War II, and this incident would threaten to destroy the alliance that 6 years of bloodshed had built up, but that is a topic for another time. In a previous video, we talked about the British invasion of Iraq during World War II, an invasion that tends to not be discussed much, but put into place many of the ongoing conflicts and situations that persist in the nation today. Yet, the invasions of the Middle East wouldn't stop there. Another nation would face the same fate as its neighbor to the west, this time by more than just one power. In today's video, we will be covering the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. Now, the situation leading up to this event is rather complicated, as is anything involving the aftermath of World War I, so this will be a bit more of a brief overview as to what happened, as some of the events would require a 20 to 30 minute video unto themselves to go into proper depth for, so please keep that in mind while watching. Iran was hit heavy during the First World War, even though the nation wasn't directly involved with either faction. Fighting in what was the Caucasus between the Ottoman and Russian troops would bleed into northwestern Iran, with Persian tribal and irregular forces soon entering the fray. The Russians had also blockaded Kherson, the main grain fields of Iran, and took possession of the animals of burden in the region, utterly destroying the food situation in the state. This was made worse when the grain reserves in Sistan were given to the British, else they faced invasion. Iran would then see itself facing a massive famine in 1916 and 17, with the influenza epidemic hitting the nation the next year. Between the famine and the disease, Iran would lose 8% to 22% of its total population from the war, even though the nation was not directly involved in the fighting. As you can imagine, the nation was politically unstable during this time as well, and various states aimed to capitalize on this. The British occupied northern Iran in 1919 to enforce their oil drilling rights in the state, and even attempted to establish a protectorate in the region, but that failed due to the ongoing chaos of the Russian Revolution and the massive flu epidemic. However, the British did hold influence in another way. The Russians had a brigade of Persian Cossacks that had been established in the 1870s, made up of largely ethnic Persians, but it had Russian officers. This force was expanded to around 8,000 men during World War I, and served as one of the main forces that fought against the Ottoman Empire in the region. Once the Russian Revolution happened though, the British got command over the brigade, and they purged it of all Russian influence, replacing the officers with British or Iranian men. This force was still loyal in theory to the Shah of Iran, and as it was effectively the only standing army for the state at the time, it was used to curb various movements across the land, such as the Soviet state in Gilan and the Atasan movement in northwestern Iran. From this time, a well-known individual would rise from relative obscurity. We will be looking at this man, Reza Khan. Reza Khan had joined the brigade when he was 16 years old, and he became the first Iranian to be appointed as Brigadier General of the brigade. He had risen rapidly through the ranks of the brigade following the British Purge, and the current government in Iran was plagued with corruption and inefficiency, made even harder by the power play over the state that the British and Russians had been waging for decades prior. Effectually, the Iranian government had zero power over the state that it held, and the British were worried about this weakness. In the event that the Communist Revolution continued to spread, and so they took matters into their own hands. On January the 14th of 1921, the British General William Ironside chose to promote Reza Khan, who had been leading the Tabriz Battalion, to lead the entire brigade. About a month later, under British direction, Reza would lead 3,000 to 4,000 men to Tehran, arriving on February the 21st, and he would seize the capital, meeting virtually no resistance. He would then install himself as the most powerful man in Iran and set about modernizing the Iranian army. With his expanded forces and the Cossack Brigade, Reza launched military actions to eliminate separatist and dissident movements across the state. The brigade, with a strength of 7,000 to 8,000 men at the time, was merged with other forces to form the new Iranian army, which numbered some 40,000, and this would be led by Iranian officers, many of them friends and cronies of Reza from his days as an officer in the Cossack Brigade. These officers received appointments and patronage in key positions in the new government and military. Once these rebellions were put down, Reza Khan removed the Shah and crowned himself as the new Shah, thus establishing the Pahlavi dynasty, calling himself Reza Shah. For years, he'd worked to modernize the nation and put it in a direct path towards neutrality in foreign affairs as much as possible. Yet, the long-term fight over the land from the Russians and British pitted opinion a bit away from either state. Iran had a long-time relationship with the Germans, who ended up being one of their main trading partners during the 20s, and the nation, even before Reza's tenure, had held these ties to act as a small counterbalance to the British and Russian influence. Relations between Britain and Iran had been strained some since 1931, when the Shah cancelled the Declaration concessions, one which gave the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company exclusive rights to sell Iranian oil for the majority of the profit. At the start of World War II, Iran would claim neutrality, but they kept trading with the Germans, and they refused to break off diplomatic ties with them or expel the German nationals that were in the nation. This refusal did worry the British government, who feared that Iran may join the German fold if they didn't do something about it, like they did in Iraq. Following Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union would become nominal allies. With the Wehrmacht steadily advancing through the Soviet Union, the Persian corridor via the Trans-Iranian Railway offered one of the easiest ways to supply the Soviets with Lend-Lease supplies. This became a major factor as U-boat attacks and the winter ice made convoys to Argelenska in the White Sea dangerous and unreliable, and the railway seemed an increasingly attractive supply route. The Soviets also had invested interest in northwestern Iran, as they wanted territory to absorb into the Union and eventually turn the whole of Iran into a communist state. The two allied nations put pressure on the Shah to meet their demands. This pressure turned into national distastement for both, and anti-British protests occurred in Tehran, which was described as pro-German by the British, because of course they would say that. And the Shah caved to some of the demands, but they continued to refuse to remove the German nationals or to fully cut off trade with the nation. The refusal to expel all Germans from the state would be used as pretext for the invasion of Iran by the British and Soviet forces, an invasion that would start on August the 25th of 1941. At the start of the conflict, the Soviets deployed 3 armies to invade northern Iran, which would number some 40,000 troops and 1,000 tanks. Of these tanks, most of them were the older T-26s, and though the tank mounted a decent 45mm gun, the T-26's thin armor and slow speed made it unable to fight against most other armor, and it was unable to withstand most modern anti-tank weaponry. With them, the Soviets had around 405 fighters and bombers at their disposal, but they faced little in the way of air opposition. To aid the Soviets, the British had around 24,000 men raised and equipped under the command of Lieutenant General Edward Quinlan. This included a handful of British regulars as well as a slew of colonial troops from around the area, many of which had been transported from India or local Iraqi militia units. The British also had an armored car company made up of 18 Rolls-Royce armored cars made during the early 1920s. The company also had 2 functional large tanks and a single Carden-Loyd tanket. They could field around 100 aircraft, which would include a mix of Gloucester Gladiators, the Hawker Odyssey, Hawker Hart light bombers, and a handful of other craft. The invasion took Iran by surprise, and they hastily built up their forces as much as they could. The Imperial Iranian Navy boasted around 9 divisions, the first and second of which enjoyed attached tank support. This was in the form of 100 Renault FT tanks from World War I and around 50 Panzer 38s, the latter being relatively fast and well armed, with 37mm guns that could tackle Allied light armor. Iran had also acquired 50 AVI-4 tankets, each armed with 2 machine guns. The Iranian army also possessed an additional 100 armored cars, some of them also armed with 37mm guns, plus roughly an additional 120 howitzers in either 75 or 100mm. In addition, they had an ample supply of mortars, light anti-tank guns, and machine guns. However, Iran's command structure was not great, and the lack of radios, in addition to an old guard that wasn't particularly effective, heavily hindered Iranian movements. To combat British and Soviet air units, the Iranian Air Force was rather lackluster, with it consisting of outdated British Hawker planes which would number around 130 craft, all but 25 of them being fighters. These planes were stationed in airfields at Tehran, Avaz, Tabriz, and Mashhad, all at locations close to the fighting, and were easy targets for British and Soviet air raids. While its army was somewhat strong independently, it could not hope to defend against 2 great powers invading from multiple fronts at the same time. At the start of the invasion, the most critical British objective was securing the oil fields at Kurdistan, centered around the city of Abadan, before they could be sabotaged. The British naval and paratrooper detachment landed at the city. The Iranians managed to put up a resistance, but the city and the refinery were captured that afternoon after heavy hand-to-hand combat, which resulted in the deaths of several British and Indian troops. More troops were landed at Kharis Sharma the same afternoon, capturing the city and the important naval port, destroying 2 Iranian sloops that were still at dock. The commander of the navy, who oversaw the troop actions in the region, Gulamani Barandor, was killed during this action. This resulted in very little organized resistance in the whole province thereafter. The British hoped to capture Avaz and then drive north to the Khwarizm, where they would link up with the British troops in central Iran and Soviet troops from the north. The British reached the outskirts of Avaz on August the 27th and were blocked by heavy Iranian defenses. The Iranians were led by General Mohammad Shakabatsky, and he had prepared a strong defense. The infantry had entrenched themselves around the city with artillery support and tanks. Although the Iranians had taken heavy losses and their morale was decreasing, they were prepared to fight hard. The Indian Army advance came to a halt, and they were hesitant to cross the Kharan River and attack the city. A British attack on the defenses around the city was repelled by Iranian tanks and infantry. However, after sporadic fighting, word had reached Sobieski that the two sides had agreed to a ceasefire, so the British and Indian troops entered the city without heavy casualties. The Soviets in the north launched their invasion on the 25th. They gained air superiority within hours, and ground troops moved towards the provisional capital of Tabriz and Abadil. Both of these locations had somewhat substantial defenses, but the commander of both garrisons fled before the fighting commenced. The Soviets attacked both towns on the 26th, and while the Iranians held out for some time, the lack of food and ammo eventually drove them to surrender. To the east, Soviet Caspian Sea forces launched a number of attacks in the Gilan province, engaging Iranian naval units in the area and landing troops in combination with an advance from the 44th Red Army, with the port city of Bandar Pahlavi and the city of Rashid being the prime targets. Iranian forces in the region put up stubborn resistance, however, and the Soviets were unable to take the cities that day. They would eventually call in heavy bomber support, and after hours of bombarding Iranian positions, they were able to capture both cities and force the surrender of a good portion of Iran's northern troops, one day before the ceasefire. With the utter collapse of his military, Raza Shah called for a ceasefire between the parties. He ordered the resignation of the pro-British Prime Minister Ali Mansur, who he blamed for demoralizing the military and thus the defeat. Mansur would be replaced with Mohammad Ali Fali, a former prime minister, who conducted negotiations with the two great powers. However, Fali was an enemy of Raza, as his son was executed under his watch. When he entered into negotiations with the British, Fali implied that both he and the Iranian people wanted to be liberated from the Shah's rule, and he pledged support in having British influence in the nation. In turn, the British and Fali agreed that for the Allies to withdraw from Iran, the Iranians would have to assure that the German minister and his staff would end up leaving Tehran, and the German, Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian embassies would close, and all remaining German nationals, including the families, to be handed over to the British and Soviet authorities. The last order would mean almost certain imprisonment, or in the case of those handed to the Soviets, most likely death. Reza Shah would delay on the last demand, and instead he did his best to secretly evacuate all Germans from Iran, and by September the 18th, most of them had escaped via the Turkish border. In response to the Shah's defiance, the Red Army moved to occupy Tehran. Fearing the execution, many people fled the city. Raza, in a handwritten letter by Faloy, announced his abdication as the Soviets entered the city on September the 17th. Yet, a problem did arise from his abdication. The British wanted to restore the Khazar dynasty to power, as they had served British interests prior to Reza's reign. However, the heir to the throne was a British citizen who spoke no Persian. So instead, Crown Prince Mohammad Rashid Pahlavi became the next Shah of Iran. Reza Shah was arrested before he was able to leave Tehran, and he was placed into British custody, where he would be sent to exile in South Africa, where he would die in 1944. The Allies withdrew from Tehran on October the 17th, and Iran was partitioned between the British and the Soviet Union for the duration of the war. The Persian corridor then became the route for a massive flow of supplies to the Soviet Union and also the British in the Middle East. The new Shah signed an alliance treaty with Britain and the Soviet Union on January the 29th of 1942, in an effort to aid the Allied war effort. In September of 43, Iran would declare war on Germany, which qualified it for membership in the United Nations. The effects of the war were very disruptive for Iran, though. Much of the state bureaucracy had been damaged by the invasion, and food and other essential items were scarce. The Soviets appropriated most of the harvest in northern Iran, leading to food shortages for the general public. The British and Soviet occupiers used the delivery of grain as a bargaining chip, and the food crisis was exacerbated because foreign troops needed to eat and use the transport network to move military equipment. When the British forced Ahmed Quaban to be Prime Minister, he butchered the food situation, no pun intended, so badly that it not only led to widespread famine, but also heavily crippled the economy, with inflation rising by over 400%. Bread riots started in 1942 and martial law was declared, with several protesters being killed as a result. During the 3 years of occupation, the Soviets had expanded their influence in Azerbaijan and Iranian Kurdistan, as well as aiding in the foundation of the Communist Party in Iran. The Soviets had attempted during their occupation to stir tensions between the tenant farmers and the landlords in the region that they occupied, aiming to get the farmers loyal to their cause. On December the 12th of 1945, after weeks of violent clashes, a Soviet-backed People's Republic of Azerbaijan was formed, with a Kurdish People's Republic also being established in late 1945. The Iranian government sent troops to re-establish control, but they were blocked by Red Army units. When the deadline for withdrawal arrived on March the 2nd of 1946, 6 months after the end of World War II, the British began to withdraw, but Moscow refused, citing threats to Soviet security. Soviet troops did not withdraw from Iran proper until May of 1946, following Iran's official complaint to the newly formed United Nations Security Council, which became the first complaint filed by a country in the UN's history. US and British pressure would eventually get the Soviets to withdraw, and the two Soviet states would be absorbed back into Iran by the end of 1946, putting another chapter of history finally to rest.